Hello and welcome to episode number 27 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, December 7th, 2014. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Hey Tony, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Oh, hi, I'm Tony Jaques. I'm a consultant working in the area of issue and crisis management based in Melbourne, Australia. And I also do quite a lot of work in the area of risk communication and risk management. In addition to that, I also teach part-time at two of the universities here in Melbourne.
Awesome. And you just wrote a book?
Yes, I did just write a book. I wasn't going to write a book at all, but I was approached by Oxford University Press saying, would I be interested in doing a book? And initially I said, I don't really want to do that at all. It seems like an awful lot of work for not much return. But they persuaded me to do that, and my little baby has now been born.
It has. So you've been working on that project for a while, haven't you?
Yes, it took me about 12 months. Initially, I thought this will be quite easy. I'll base it on some of the stuff I've already had published. But that idea didn't actually work out very well, and most of the contents had to actually, of course, be completely rewritten. So I was a bit naive to start with.
I think that's probably common with first-time authors. But it's not like it's not a long book.
No, I'm not really a first-time author. I've previously published a dictionary of battles and sieges.
Huh.
That was 600,000 words. It got published by an American publisher, but that took me just over 10 years to write. So I'm not going to do that again.
Oh wow. Very cool. So so that's what I was saying. When I sat down to read it, I realized that it's long. It's longer than the traditional book, but you go into extensive detail on issue management, crisis management, and risk management. All three.
Yes, I do. And then I also try to put those within a framework of reputation about how those things can affect reputation and what you can do about it.
Very cool. So talking about that, I want to talk about the book. One thing that I find that I think it answers, I think that the book actually, after reading it, answers a lot of questions in terms of a lot of professionals. They just want help. They want to better understand from A to Z what needs to be done for crisis planning. And you really answer that question.
Yes, one of the themes I've tried to develop in the book is the idea that crisis management is a truly integrated discipline across a whole range of activities. Some people think that crisis management involves simply writing a manual, having the occasional simulation, and then hopefully putting it all together in the event that a crisis strikes. My approach, which is developed from ideas largely developed by Europeans, is that crisis management starts way before the crisis actually occurs, right back in the area of identifying potential issues. And so that's the way I see it. That's actually part of the integrated way of looking at crises. And then it goes right through problem identification, putting plans in place, crisis prevention as well as crisis preparedness, then, of course, managing the crisis itself. And then also, I like to focus on the things that happen after the crisis has happened. A lot of books suggest that the only thing that you do after a crisis is business continuity or operational recovery. But that's simply not true, because after a crisis, there's what some people have called the crisis after the crisis, which is all the problems that organizations face after the crisis event itself is actually over. And this period, interestingly enough, can actually be more damaging and contain more risk to reputation than the actual crisis itself. It might be things like inquiries, litigation, getting sued, coroner's inquests, and so on. And often reputation is more at risk after the crisis than during the crisis itself.
It's very true. And you actually just recently wrote a blog post for the Crisis Intelligence blog about the crisis after the crisis. And I have to say that there was a lot of discussion that happened on LinkedIn and on different social networks from that blog post. So people are interested in better understanding what the crisis after the crisis means and implies.
Yeah, I think that it's actually a largely misunderstood area. It's a very, very natural thing when a crisis is over. It's very natural, I think, for managers to say, phew, thank goodness that's over. Let's just move on and let's not spend too much time on it. That's a very natural thing to do. But in actual fact, the risks that apply after a crisis are very, very real. And there's lots and lots of cases where organizations have got through the crisis itself reasonably well and then have stumbled terribly in the things that happen after the crisis, as I said, like legal action and inquests and so on. There was a really interesting case here in Australia where a gas production plant owned by Esso, which supplied the city of Melbourne, had a very bad explosion which killed 2 or 3 people and shut down the entire gas supply for the city for 2 weeks, which was an extremely dramatic event. And during that time, the public thought the company was doing a pretty good job trying to get the gas restored. But after the gas was restored, then there was a whole series of inquiries and inquests, and the company's reputation was extremely badly damaged when they tried to blame it all on some individuals who operated the plant, some of whom were dead and were not able to answer for themselves. And ultimately, the inquiry found that the fault was absolutely entirely that of the company, not of the operators. And there are some people who think that occurred because when the crisis was happening, the people on the ground drove it. But after the crisis was over, it was driven by lawyers at head office in America. And we all know what happens when you let lawyers get loose.
Yes. So, and it's interesting that we're kind of, conversation went to the crisis after the crisis first, but what are some, it's here, and then I want to kind of talk about it a little bit more. That's a good example to show, the impacts of it. But what are some strategies that organizations need to think about and put into place before the crisis so that they manage the crisis after the crisis?
Yes. Well, they don't necessarily go together, but there's a number of really, really practical strategies people can put in place before the crisis. Let me just divert for a moment, Melissa, and point out that there's 2 separate things. One is crisis preparedness, and the other is crisis prevention. And these 2 things often get confused. Crisis preparedness is all the basic stuff which you read about in every textbook on crisis management. Preparing a manual, identifying a team, having simulations, getting contact lists in place. These things are very important. But the important thing really here is this. They don't prevent the crisis happening in the first place. So what I call crisis preparedness is just the stuff you do to help you when the crisis strikes. I like to add a second element, which I call crisis prevention, which is the things you can do to actually reduce the chance of the crisis happening in the first place. Obviously, there's no way you can possibly guarantee that no crisis will ever happen because that would be unrealistic. But there are a lot of things you can do to reduce the chance of a crisis hitting in the first place. And the most important one of those, of course, is to identify potential crises before they happen and take concrete action. That's really the key to it. And so I like to see that as part of the, if you like, the continuum of crisis management activity.
I agree.
And the most important of those, of course, is issue management, because I'm sure you've heard the expression that a crisis is an issue that wasn't managed. I'm sure you've heard that expression.
Yes.
And then when you say to people, okay, you think that's true? They say, yep. You say, okay, well, what are you doing to actually prevent crises? At which point there's a sort of a long silence and, can I phone a friend sort of moment takes place. And people don't see issue management and crisis prevention as being part of the crisis prevention continuum.
It's funny because when I just off the top of my mind, I talk about this often, but most recently I was interviewed for an IT publication that's about to come out that they wanted to focus on crisis management. And they were asking me questions about, how do you plan for crisis? How do you prepare for crisis? And they were going through the traditional SWOT analysis and different things like that. So I have a different approach. Similar, but different approach when I do it with clients. So I was talking about that approach. And I was talking about, brainstorming, nothing's off the table. If you can think it can happen, sit down with the right people within your organization. And this needs to be a big assortment of different people from different departments and different relationships with your brand as well as with your different stakeholders. And start brainstorming worst case scenarios, vulnerabilities, where you're left vulnerable, where you might not realize, all these different things. And then the question came of, okay, so what do you do after that? You have to plan. And I said, well, the first thing you do after that is you take that list and you categorize it into preventable crises and unpreventable crises. And your first step is to actually go and then take action and prevent the preventable crises. And the person interviewing me who had interviewed apparently a long list of other crisis professionals just stopped and went, oh, that's a good idea. I was like, yeah, no kidding. Crisis prevention is the best form of crisis management.
It's a strange thing, I did a research project. I interviewed the CEOs of a number of Australian companies about what they do to prepare for crises. And I put the same question to all of them. I said, would you agree with the statement that prevention is the best possible method of crisis management? And every single one of them said, absolutely. They all just totally agreed. And then I said, okay, so what are you doing for crisis prevention? And that's when this sort of long silence happened, because people think it's a great idea, but they're not sure how to do it. And issue management is a framework of doing that. One of the things I've found in all the work I've done in issue management, the question I most often get asked, I think, is, where do issues come from, and how do you know which ones to work on? And that question is really quite easily answered. People have the idea that most crises are sudden, unexpected events, but as we know from a lot of research, including the Institute for Crisis Management in Kentucky, we know that most crises are not sudden events at all. Most crises are what the Institute for Crisis Management called smouldering issues, but the language doesn't really matter what you call them. The reality is that most crises do in fact have a whole lot of red flags or warning signs, and you need to be able to recognize those. And unfortunately, organizations don't recognize them, and sometimes they deliberately don't recognize them, and of course finish up with crises. There's many very sad examples, I'm afraid to say, of companies which have seen things coming, have done nothing about them, and then wonder why they get smacked around the head by a real crisis.
We get into the question of ethical, management at that point. But it's what's interesting is, these red flags that are very, very important to understand what they are and enable your team to actually identify them, especially your frontline team. But these red flags fall into both categories of crisis preparedness and crisis prevention.
Absolutely they do. One of the things that I've found in my research in the area of crises, one thing that happens after every crisis, almost without fail, is that somebody in the organization says, oh yeah, I knew about that. It almost always happens. To which the obvious question is, if you knew about it, why the heck didn't you tell somebody? And sometimes they say, I didn't know who to tell. And other times they say, I did tell somebody, but they didn't listen to me. And that's a really, really sad thing that happens, that people inside the organization know stuff, and they either don't tell somebody or they tell somebody and nobody listens. And so I think that one of the most important elements of crisis prevention is having a system in place whereby people who work for you can put up their hand and say, look, there's something I think needs attention. Doesn't have to be a very complex online electronic issue identification process, which some companies have. Doesn't need to be like that. But people need to understand that they actually have a role in identifying things. And I mean, people sometimes say that, who's responsible for safety? Everybody. Who's responsible for reputation? Everybody. These things become a wee bit of a cliche. But in issue management or crisis prevention, I think that it's absolutely true. Everybody should say there's a problem here and it needs to get attention. I mean, a good example, I think, is in customer service. If some people ring up customer service and complain about something, that's what happens all the time. But if 20 or 30 or 40 people ring up customer service with the same complaint, is there a mechanism by which somebody says, we should give this special attention, not just treat each case individually? So, I mean, customer service is a really good example, I think, of how information at the public interface doesn't get translated into somebody saying, this is a concern and we need to take action about it.
It's important, and it's something I agree that on one or the other front gets overlooked, or maybe even executives think that we have a system in place and it's working, but they're not actually testing to make sure that it's working. And one of the important things for that system is to enable the ability to report something anonymously. Because not everybody feels completely comfortable to come forth with reporting an issue. It might be an internal issue that they feel that they may be reprimanded for.
I think that's very true. I mean, there are two separate things, I think, here, Melissa. I mean, one is identifying things like I mentioned with, customer interface, or, I went to a conference and heard something, feeding those things back. But the one of doing things anonymously is also important. And you need to have a system for doing that as well. Often, the company I used to work for had what they called an ethics line, which was you could ring a number and it went to an independent organization, not the company, to report something that was not correct. And that actually got used to identify. I know in one particular case, it was one country where a secretary saw her boss receiving large amounts of cash in brown envelopes, and she reported that, and it turned out to be a bribery case, which led to a whole lot of actions. But she would not have done that if she'd had to report it through the formal company system. So she was able to do it anonymously. Unfortunately, we know that management and executive misbehaviour is a major source of corporate crises, much, much more than people realise. Sexual harassment, racial discrimination, harassment, these are things that can really, really damage organisations. And unfortunately, they are much, much more prevalent than most companies like to believe. Most managers will say, we don't do that here. Of course, the answer is, well, yes, you do. And the potential for crisis is enormous.
I agree. So one thing that I really liked about your book, Tony, there's a lot of things that I liked, but you really, it's kind of divided into three sections. So you have issue management, you have crisis management, and then you have risk management. And what I really liked was how in-depth you go into all three, but primarily issue versus crisis. Because so many, you have no idea how many times I get asked in anything, whether I'm working with an organization or I'm doing a presentation or a training or a webinar or an interview, that people say, what's the difference between an issue and a crisis? And then the other thing is that people don't really think of a crisis management plan or crisis prevention, but you don't necessarily think of an issues management plan or issues prevention. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about the two, to really give organizations or professionals a really good understanding of the two, as your book does. And there was one quote that I believe it's yours, that you put into the book that I really liked, and that is, issue management is about steering the ship out of troubled water, while crisis management is about saving the ship after it's struck an iceberg. I thought that one just nailed it.
I'm glad you like that. Yeah, that came from an earlier book I wrote. I agree with you completely about the lack of understanding or lack of distinction, if you like, between issues and crises. One of the problems, I think, Melissa, is the fact that the word crisis has got incredibly devalued over the years, that people use the word crisis to define things that are really just relatively minor problems. And so
social media crisis. That's one that's just out there. And
of course, most aren't really crises.
They're issues. Absolutely.
You read about some film star who wears the wrong dress to a premiere, and it's called a fashion disaster. I mean, it ain't a disaster. It's embarrassing, but the word disaster also gets completely misunderstood. I think that the way I do it when I get asked this question, and not like you, I get asked the question many, many times about what's the difference. I say to people that one of the key differences between an issue and a crisis is two elements. One is time, and the other is choice. When you're facing an issue, you've got time to think about it. You can think about options, you can get together, you can have an issue management strategy meeting, you can develop options, you can think of different ways of doing things, and then you've got time to say which would suit us best, who's the best audience, what's the best channel of communication, and all the sorts of things you'd normally do when you're managing an issue. But when you have a crisis, you don't have time and you don't have choice. When you've got a crisis, the best decisions you could have made, the ones you should have made 5 minutes ago. And you don't have a choice to say, how shall we deal with this? You can't say, for example, let me give you a simple example. You wouldn't say, shall we have a press conference? Shall we have one-to-one interviews? Shall we talk to the media? Shall we put out a press statement? You can't be having that discussion if the TV channel is down at reception demanding to see somebody. You don't have that choice. I mean, you're going to have to talk to TV whether you like it or not. Whereas if you're back in the issue management process, you can think through, shall I talk to TV? Maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. You can't do that when it's a crisis. When there's a TV camera in your face, you can't say, I wonder if talking to TV is a good idea. So you don't have time, you don't have choice. There's obviously all the other things as well, scale and impact and so on. But to me, time and choice are two of the criteria that help distinguish these two things.
Good explanation. And diving into, if we wanted to look a little bit at issues management, because I think that crisis management is something that people have not a good enough grasp on, but they have even less of a grasp on issues management and what that looks like. So I love that you really put out there that, issue is what happens before the crisis, or is part of, managing an issue is crisis prevention. Absolutely. And there's another thing that there's another quote from your book that I really liked, and I thought it was pretty clear, was that the misconception of issues is often that an issue is a problem or that a problem is an issue. And that's not true. And you define that by saying problems are solved and issues need to be resolved.
Yeah. I'll come, if I hold that thought just for a second, I'd like to go back to something you said before, which was about people have a reasonable understanding of crisis management. I don't think they do.
Oh, yeah.
I think people have a reasonable understanding of crisis response. And that's different. People have a reasonable understanding of responding to crises, setting up spokespersons and all that sort of thing. And many, many people who write about crisis management are actually writing about crisis response. What you do, when it all goes pear-shaped. Mm-hmm. But if you think about crisis management as being this much, much broader thing, then people don't have a lot of understanding of it. They don't have a lot of understanding of, how crisis management fits within the organization and preparation and preparedness and so on and so on. So I think that if you distinguish between crisis management and crisis response, it's a helpful distinction to get in people's minds.
Oh, absolutely. What I meant by that is not necessarily that they have a very good understanding, it's that they have more of an understanding than issue management.
Exactly. Or alternatively, I think they've got a good understanding. And I think some people do crisis response pretty well. I did a job for a big organization, Melissa, and they said to me, Tony, we're not very good at issue management, but boy, oh boy, are we good at crisis response. We really throw in resources. And I felt like saying, are you insane? Have you been smoking lumpy cigarettes, But of course, seeing they're a client, I was very polite to them. But the idea in this organization that we're not very good at issue management, but we're good at crisis management, was just a complete misunderstanding of their vulnerability. I mean, some people say, crisis is both an opportunity and a danger. I mean, to me, that is just nonsense. Most, 99.9% of crises are not an opportunity. It's just a myth to think that a crisis can be an opportunity. Yes, there are vague occasions when it does happen, but most crises are negative and dangerous and damaging reputation. That's the reality, whatever the textbooks might tell you to the contrary. Sorry, I forgot what were the other questions?
Well, actually, for sure. But just to, I like that you just said that, because one of the ways that I define issue versus crisis in some of the workshops I do or some of the conferences I speak at, and because I think that unless it's really, really understood, it's more abstract as a definition. It's harder to grasp. So you're talking about crises are not opportunities. There's rare opportunities that can come from them, but really it's an impactful and damaging, long-term damaging impact on reputation and bottom line on the organization. Issues, on the other hand, when you're dealing with an issue, when you spot an issue early on, when you're able to transform an issue, issues present much more opportunity. And that's because they aren't crises, but that's because they open the door, and we see a lot of that on social or online when an organization is faced with an issue and they have to deal with it. You can either let it escalate, you could either extinguish it, hopefully, but you could also, in most cases, transform, because you already have the light on you, the limelight's on you. So, and it's on you in a negative way, but if you respond properly and if you understand the expectations of your stakeholders, in so many situations, you can actually take that issue and turn it into a positive PR opportunity to connect you closer to your stakeholder and audience groups. So I think that's funny that's great that you just said that you brought up that point on crises are not opportunity, but issues are.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, issues can be opportunities, whereas once it gets a crisis, there's not much opportunity. I used to work for an American company. One of my American colleagues used to call it, he said, Tony, this is what we call a problem-tunity.
Oh, man.
We all know that Americans like making up words, but, I mean, there was a certain amount of truth in that issues are what he called problem-tunities. They are a problem, but they do contain opportunity as well, whereas once the thing's a crisis, trying to find gold in a crisis is a pretty hard task.
The best outcome of a crisis is to manage the crisis effectively and to not lose many points on your reputation or bottom line.
Absolutely.
Issues are the opposite. You can actually turn an issue and come out of it with more positive than negative.
I agree entirely. And one really good example of this is in legislation. When the government or the state government, whatever it happens to be, is planning to change a law, if you know that you cannot resist that change being made, you can turn that into an opportunity by saying, we're going to somehow turn this thing to our advantage. We're going to work on this to make ourselves the leaders in this new approach or whatever. There are real opportunities. I mean, a good example I heard about when I went to an issue management conference in the US some years ago was Westinghouse, when they very early on said, water's going to be a problem. And people said, no, water? How can water be a problem? And they said, yes, it will be. And so they developed low water use washing machines and dishwashers long before other companies had done the same. And when water did become an issue and the government started to say, let's have standards and ratings for water use, Westinghouse found themselves way out in front because they already had low water use washing machines and dishwashers. Obviously, others caught up quickly, but it was an example of how they saw a potential problem, dealt with it in an operational sense, and were able to reap a real benefit from it until the rest of the market caught up.
Awesome. I love those stories. Then another point of issues is that perception is reality. So, and we see this often where an issue isn't dealt with because management or executives or the board of directors, they realize that there is some form of issue or some form of perception out with the public, but it's not reality. So they don't deal with it, and it escalates into a crisis.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems that we have, particularly in these social media days, is that when I started in this business, which was a few years ago now, back in the days when we used to have a communication app called a typewriter, the idea that it was just Mrs. Bloggs and her friends who had a problem meant that they could be sort of pushed to one side, and they say, look, that's a misperception. It's only got a few people who are worried about it. Let's not put effort into that. But these days in social media, we know from so many cases that it only takes a couple of individuals who decide to make a case of something that it is going to be an issue. And I like to use, when I first started writing about issue management, I used to use the letter capital I for issue rather than a small I, but most of the publishers wouldn't let me do that. But I like to think about the capital I issues versus the small I issues as being different. Small I issues are things that happen every day. Capital I issues are things that are really likely to potentially damage the organization. And if you think about it like that, that helps you distinguish from those sort of, day-to-day problems. Because going back to what you asked me earlier on about...
I was just going to say that it ties that right in.
Very nice segue there, yeah. But the difference between problems and issues is really important. And to me, rather than trying to have some clever form of words as definition, I like to describe things rather than define them. In other words, say what they're like rather than just some clever definition. And one of the key areas that makes an issue different from a problem is the actual nature of issues. The fact that there's no right answer, that they're not black and white, that they involve people's emotions, that they involve contentious matters. These are the sort of things that characterize issues as opposed to just ordinary problems. If you think about a problem, I always think about school mathematics books. You know that you can turn to the back of the maths book and there is the official answer there. The teacher knows the official answer's there and they don't care. What the teacher wants you to do is show how you got that correct answer. But there is a right answer. Issues aren't like that. You can't turn to the back of the textbook and find the right answer because there simply isn't a right answer. You have to negotiate the answer. You have to modify your opinion. You have to listen to the other person's opinion, and then you have to somehow agree on an answer. And that's what resolve means as opposed to solve. So solving is what you do for problems. To solve something means to find the right answer. But if there is no right answer, which is what happens with issues, you have to resolve them. That is, you have to develop an answer. You have to negotiate an answer. And that's something which people find quite uncomfortable. The the management of many organizations these days is still comprised largely of people who come from technical disciplines, engineers, accountants, business analysts, chemists, and so on. And these are all people who've been brought up their whole, and lawyers I should add, these are all people who've been brought up through their education and through their training saying, give me the answer, present me with the right answer. That's the way they've been brought up. It's their training, it's their culture. And when you present them with something and say, hey, by the way, there is no right answer, some of those people find it quite uncomfortable because they're so used to being, there is a right answer. I know how to build a bridge. There's certain technologies I put into my bridge to make sure it takes the appropriate weight and doesn't fall down. That's how bridge builders think. But if you then say to them, hey, by the way, the public might not like your bridge because it's ugly, they'll say, what do the public know about bridge building? And of course, the answer, as we all know, is that the public don't know much about bridge building, but they have strong opinions about what's an ugly bridge or not an ugly bridge. And you can't go to the textbook and find a chapter called Measuring Ugliness because there's no such thing. So that's how problems are different from issues. They've got all these matters of opinion and so on. And the idea of saying, who cares what the public think, is, of course, just no longer acceptable. There was a time when people, if the public had a concern, a company would say to the angry member of the public, here's a textbook about it, read it, and give me a call if you've got any questions. That was okay once, but it's not okay anymore.
I like that a lot. I like that analogy. I was hearing a lot of banging, actually, while you were talking, so I don't hear it now. So I was going to see what was wrong with that, but that's okay. So no, I really like that analogy, and I think that one of the things that you said is, and it needs to be underlined, is to resolve an issue, you have to listen. It's about these two-way communications today and actually understanding that could be an issue if you don't listen and if you don't understand that everything right today, and it will continue to be that way, is two-way in terms of communication.
And one of the problems we got, Melissa, is that even today, many big managements don't see this. I'll give you an example. I had a call from a friend of mine who works for a large civil construction company, and they had just received a contract from the government to build a highway. And they called her in and said, oh, by the way, we'd like you to work on the community engagement piece. And just before you do that, we have to tell you there's no budget. She said, what? They said, no. When we applied for the contract, because it's a government contract, we had to tick a box saying you'll engage with the government, but we didn't put any money in it because that would have made our tender uncompetitive. So can you please do that and don't spend any money? That's when she rang me and said, Tony, what do I do? Can you please come and talk to my managers? The problem here was that even though they knew public engagement was going to be critical to building this highway, they knew that with their heart. With their brain, they said, we're going to put nothing in the contract for it because it'll make us uncompetitive. And so even though we know that managers know these things, they still just somehow persuade themselves that they're not important.
It's interesting. I think we'll see with time that I already see a lot of organizations that are understanding the risk of that and understanding how to go about not doing that, or correcting it within their corporate culture. But I think that we're a long ways from seeing everybody understanding that. But I think it'll come with time.
I think that's true. And in fact, interestingly enough, public relations generally is a strange business because if you want to be a violinist, for example, you study great violin players. Or if you want to be a great writer, you study the great writers. If you want to be a great runner, you watch videos of the great runners, don't you? But when you're doing public relations, we tend to study the case of the people who did it really, really badly and screwed it up, which is a strange dichotomy, isn't it? We tend to learn in public relations from people who do it badly rather than from people who do it well, which is a sad reflection on our business, isn't it?
I guess so. I tend to do both. I love strong cases of organizations who have done, amazing, either issues management or crisis management or response. But at the same time, I suppose that some of that, looking at the negative, goes to the fact that the best form of crisis management is crisis prevention. So we don't really get the tales of the crisis prevention unless you were there internally and saw it firsthand.
Absolutely. And I also know that a lot of issue management cases that have been really, really well handled do not get published. They don't get written up for PR awards, because the companies who do them say, please don't tell people how we did that.
Yeah, please don't undo everything we did.
I like to think about issue management as being like cosmetic surgery. That is to say, you want people to admire the results of the cosmetic surgery, but you don't want them to know what you had done. You don't want them to know what it cost. And in fact, you don't really want them to know you had anything done. You just want them to admire the results. And that's a bit like issue management.
You've got a ton of great analogies, don't you?
Yeah, maybe.
You have something that I'd love for you to dive into, and that is the 6 essential values of issue management, of an issues management plan. I have it open in front of me, so if you don't remember them off the top of my head, I can list each one. You can maybe talk a little bit about it. But I think pardon me?
What's the page number?
On my document, it's page 99, but that's of total. I think it's page 78.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. So I think that because, like we said at the beginning, issues management versus crisis management, or issues preparedness versus crisis preparedness, it's not, people focus on, if they focus on anything, they focus on the crisis side. So let's give your 6 essential values for issues management so that people can start to really grasp what that looks like, and hopefully walk away from listening to this podcast and say, okay, I've got some things to actually help me work on this.
Okay, we'll just have to stop for a moment, Melissa, because I have to turn to the right page, okay?
No problem.
Edit that bit. 6 values.
So I have it on 78. Hold on. It's on the values planning model.
Yep. About utility, simplicity, clarity,
Yes.
etc. Okay. All right. Let's I want to make... There's so many things in this damn book, I have to remember which bit's which.
There's so many things in this book. I love that. It's really, it's like the textbook for issues and crisis management.
I mean, it really is. It's written as a textbook, but I believe it's going to have real application to practitioners. That was my intention.
Oh, I agree. And the case studies you use and all of that, it doesn't read as a textbook in the sense that it's a boring read. That's for sure. It's an informative, actionable read, and it flows well. It's an interesting read. I found anyway.
All right, let's go back where we were then, shall we? Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So the 6 essential values of issues management planning.
One of the important things about an issue management plan is that if it's just a plan that everyone sits around and thinks about and then puts on a shelf somewhere, it is of no value at all, as applies to so much planning. So in order to be effective and not just a pipe dream people thought about when they went to some expensive resort somewhere and ate and drank an awful lot, I think that an issue management plan has to have 6 values. The first of those is utility. Is it useful? Can it actually be put into practical action? Because one of the problems is that sometimes issue management plans are things that you think were a wonderful idea but weren't really practical. The second thing is simplicity. It's got to use unambiguous language, and the plan has got to have a minimum number of steps. I've seen issue management plans which have got so many action steps and little arrows and yes/no boxes that they are impossible to follow. And so therefore it's got to be something you can say, yep, I know what I need to do. I can memorize those steps and I can get this done. And the other thing, of course, about it before I move on is that it's got to be explainable to non-communication professionals. Non-communication professionals need to say, yep, I understand what that means and I can do that. The next step is clarity. It's easy to follow. And this is the same point. Top management need to understand what it is you're going to do. And if the thing's so complicated that nobody can understand it, then nothing will happen. there's no good having a brilliant management plan, a brilliant issue management plan, if top management can't understand it, because they'll never say, yes, go do that. So it needs to be written in a way that top management and others who are not communication professionals can say, yes, I understand exactly what it is you're trying to do. I understand how you're going to do it. I understand who's going to do it. And here's a tick, go do it. The fourth point is relevance. The issue management plan has to actually address the issue. Sometimes plans that I've seen and helped people work through, they've got an idea that's a really good idea addressing some broader community problem or some societal issue, but doesn't actually address the issue as it impacts the organization. So the plan has to be very, very relevant to the issue and to the organization. The fifth important thing about an issue management plan is versatility. The plan has to be a model which can apply to all sorts of issues. Some issues are huge and last for years and years. When you think about issues like, for example, the anti-smoking campaign, or the campaign to stop the Japanese killing whales in the southern oceans, these are issues which have lasted for years and years and still need issue plans, whereas other issues are going to be relatively short-lived. They might be relating to a new piece of legislation coming in. They might be related to a product. They might be quite short-lived. So the issue management plan has to be versatile enough to be able to deal with the huge, big issues, which last many years, but also quite short issues that are going to be quickly dealt with and hopefully resolved, although issues, of course, never really get resolved. I always like the saying that issues never die, they only go to sleep for a while, but we're going to use word resolve, meaning resolved for the moment. And the fourth thing, the sixth thing, is what I call accessibility. That's not a very good word because there isn't really a very good word to define it. But accessibility to me is, can we assess progress as we are moving on? One of the things about issue management plans, in my experience, is that when they last for a long time, over months or years, you have to be able to assess the fact, have we made progress? In other words, have we got milestones along the way, as opposed to have we achieved our objective? The anti-smoking campaign is a really good example of that. The anti-smoking campaign has been fought by many organizations over decades now. And have they achieved their ultimate objective, stopping people smoking? No, they haven't. Are they close to that? No, they're not. But that doesn't mean that all the things they've done along the way haven't been great successes. So they can assess as a great success individual steps along the way. For example, let's stop people smoking in movie theaters. Let's stop people smoking in restaurants. Let's stop advertising smoking to young children and so on. So each of those things can be seen as an accessible step along the way towards the bigger goal. So those are the 6 things which, if your issue management plan addresses those 6 things, you've got far, far more chance of it succeeding, being successful, than if it's a complex manual in a 3-ring binder sitting on the shelf gathering dust.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I would add for number 6, a word that would help maybe with the accessibility is adaptability. Both of those complement, and making sure, to assess and then to adapt the plan.
Yes, that's right. Because one of the things that happens in plans is that sometimes the issue genuinely changes through the progress of its life. And when I recommend, when I do issue management plans with companies and facilitate them developing plans, nearly always somebody says, what about if the issue changes? And my answer to that is, if the issue genuinely changes, then you need to go back and adapt. But the worst mistake is to keep imagining that it's changing all the time. In other words, every time the issue management team meets, you say, is our definition still right? If you do that, you don't make progress. So there needs to be a balance between saying, let's put a stake in the ground and start working on this versus let's keep rethinking it all the time. Because if you keep on rethinking it, keep on redefining it, keep on doing all those other process things, you never actually make progress. It's like planting carrots in the ground. You can't keep on pulling them out of the ground and saying, gee, I wonder if it's growing okay. You have to leave them in the ground for a while for them to grow. And the same applies to issues. Yes, you need to be aware of the fact that they might change, but you've also got to put a stake in the ground and let the issue management plan run its course.
I like that. And for number one, utility, I would also just say that, okay, so you have utility, the plan needs to be useful and can be put into practical action. And to complement that or to add to that, I'd say that when it comes to issues management, often you see that it's your front line that have the first indicators or come across it first. They have the first opportunity to identify an issue because they're on the front line, and that could be in the realm of social media or online, or it could be with customer support. And so making sure the utility aspect of making sure that your plan is useful is also making sure that it's useful to your frontline and that you provide them with tools like an issues management response flow chart, for example, that they can actually tangibly look at something and get quick answers to important questions so that they can identify the red flags, which we've already acknowledged as being a major fault or issue within issues management where they're not identified or they're not acknowledged, and two, know how to take that issue and turn it into an opportunity rather than let it escalate.
Yeah. And there's you're talking about doing things in the front line, but that brings me to one other point I'd like to make before we run out of time, and that's this, that none of this issue or crisis management will happen unless top management is there and is supporting and it's in full agreement. Too often, we find that senior managers want to delegate these things downwards in the organization. So in my model, it says you've got to have top management support. That does not mean the CEO walking past your desk and saying, you're doing a great job, Melissa, carry on. That's not top management support. The CEO walks past your desk and says, Melissa, what can I do? How can I help? What role do you want me to play? How can I use my network? And if you don't have top managers saying that I've got ownership of this thing and I've got skin in the game, then it's all going to fall to pieces. So my concluding comment, I think, would be to say that top management, top executive, have got to say issue management is important. Issue management will help prevent crises, and I feel that I've got a role in doing these things.
Absolutely. So if you're listening to this podcast, bring it to your upper management or your department lead. Bring it to the table. Issues management, it's not the same as crisis management. And the first place I would recommend starting, honestly, is Tony's book. So Tony, your book is called Issue and Crisis Management, Exploring Issues, Crises, Risk, and Reputation.
That's right.
So simple, clear, and to the point.
It is a pretty simple title, and I mean, it's we played with a number of titles, to be honest, and in the end we came down with really simple issue and crisis management, and it's available online from Amazon and other big booksellers. You just need to go in there and put issue and crisis management, put in my name, Tony Jaques, and spell it right, Jaques. No, it hasn't got a C in it. I'm not really, and then it's easily available, and the publisher is Oxford University Press.
And I will be, of course, linking to it from the show notes of this podcast, no matter where you're listening to it, whether you're listening to it from the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com, from iTunes, or from Stitcher. Tony, apart from your book, where can people find and follow you?
I run a 2 weekly regular newsletter about issues in crisis management, which people can subscribe to for free. They can go to my website, which is www.issue, singular, outcomes plural.com.au. And on that, they can subscribe to my newsletter, which is called Managing Outcomes. It comes out every 2 weeks, and it talks quite briefly, normally 400 to 500 words, about some topical subject relating to issues in crises.
And you also write for my blog on the occasion.
I also write for other people's blogs and write guest blogs as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Tony, I could talk about issues management all day long, and I'm really actually happy that we there were so many angles that we could have covered after reading your book, but I'm glad that we focused in on this one because, like we've said, I think that there's just so many question marks out there, and if hopefully this listen will have provided some useful information to people listening and help them along their way of developing their issues management plan. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to the Crisis Intelligence Podcast over on the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com/blog or on iTunes or on Stitcher. And while you're at it, head on over to iTunes and Stitcher and would really appreciate it if you left us a review and your feedback. You can also follow me on Twitter at Melissa_Agnes. And if you'd like to reach out to me to ask me a follow-up question from this week or a past podcast, or if you'd like to discuss the possibility of having me come and speak at an upcoming event, then you could email me directly at magnes@agnesday.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.